Unmuted. And
These aren't the ones with the actual.
no, they should be. Do you want to test?
And everyone here, all the way to that. Hello. Yeah. So it might seem like a bit overkill to have mics for this space, but actually today it's turning out to be very useful. We're not sure what that is, but we work with what we've got, and also we've got a wonderful online audience who are watching from home. So we need to speak into the microphone so that they can also hear what we're saying. So at the end, when we do questions, we will ask you to either speak into the microphone or we will repeat the questions into the microphone so that people can get them. Those are the logistics. Welcome, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to see you here. I'm Jessica Gaitán Johannesson. I work as a digital campaigns manager here at Lighthouse, and I'm a climate justice organizer and author. And it's a huge pleasure to be able to host this event today. We've got Laurie Parsons here for 2 days in Scotland, which is one. Maybe you're staying for longer. Yeah. But you're in Glasgow tomorrow, so it's really wonderful that you were able to make a stop in Edinburgh at Lighthouse. Carbon Colonialism, this wonderful, wonderful book. I think there's one of the really difficult things, and it's to challenge simplifications, to kind of pull the plug on so many of the lack of nuance and of the simplification that allow polluters to keep polluting and allow for capitalist destruction, basically. It kind of opens the door on these hiding places that we just don't see because we're not meant to see them. And it pulls together so many different strands that are all absolutely necessary to have a meaningful conversation about climate justice. So before I hand over to Laurie to do a wee presentation for us, I'm just going to introduce you briefly, just for those of you to get an idea of what you've done before. So Laurie Parsons is a senior lecturer in human geography at Royal Holloway University of London and principal investigator of the project, the disaster trade, the hidden footprints of UK imports and investment overseas, and hot trends, how the global garment industry shapes climate vulnerability in Scotland. His other books include Going Nowhere Fast, Inequality in the Age of Translocality, and Climate Change in the Global Marketplace. So a big round of applause for Laurie Parsons.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks to everyone for coming here. I must say, really exciting in particular for me to be able to be here and to be able to talk about this book, which is in many ways the culmination of 15 years of work, conversations, of explorations and stories that I've collected over the years in the Global South and elsewhere. So that's what this is really, a point of integration, a pinnacle of all of that coming together. It's a brilliant moment to be able to share that. It's also a really big story to tell, and this is one of the difficult things about it. This is a book that attempts to tell a story of global economic change, global economic development, global environmental destruction, all interlinked in a complex and interwoven way. It's not easy to do, and it's not easy for someone like me to get my head around. So one of the things that I try to do as much as possible in the book is to bring it down to a human level. So rather than trying to start to tell this story on a global scale, I try to tell it, and I will try to tell it now, through the eyes of a real person involved in all of this. So I'd like to introduce you to start with to this person here. This is Sophia. Sophia is someone I met 5 years ago while scaling the side of a landfill site on the outskirts of Phnom Penh. She worked as a waste collector and a dump designed for the international garment industry. She's in many ways a very normal person. She's a mother of 3, she's around 40 years old, working very hard to try to pay off a loan for a small house that she built a few kilometers away. The interesting thing I came to realize about Sophia, though, is that she is, in fact, from the point of view of global climate governance, completely invisible, as is the dump on which she works. And that seems surprising, given that we can see her with our own eyes. But in fact, when it comes to sustainability and the promises made around sustainability, invisibility is pretty much the norm. That's why we get brands like Puma that can claim that there's only one forever, let's make it better, whilst dumping their waste only a few meters away from their factory, how Adidas can call for an end to plastic waste while contributing to plastic waste just a few minutes after their production processes are complete, why Nike can make the entreaty such as this to move to zero without even moving their own waste away from the landfill that we've just seen. It's all enough to make us a little bit cynical about this kind of thing, and not just about the narratives around sustainability, but also about the numbers, and in particular this number. I don't know if anyone recognises this. It came to prominence in particular a couple of years ago at COP26 in Glasgow, when this was the headline figure around the great environmental sustainability successes of the United Kingdom, prompted by Boris Johnson and others. Now, this figure refers to the amount that, in percentage terms, we've reduced our carbon footprint domestically since 1990, 43% down, which, if you take it at face value, is a huge achievement. It means that we've reduced our total domestic carbon emissions back to the level of 1890, back when the streets of London looked like this. And it was prompted, of course, as an enormous political achievement on those terms. But actually, this kind of narrative of this huge reduction by leading economies like the UK is presented at the foundations of sustainability policy, not as an individual political achievement, but actually as a scientific inevitability. If we look at this curve here, this is what's known as the environmental Kuznets curve, which argues that the transition from pre-industrial, low environmental impact societies via polluting industrial societies, such as the UK in the mid-century, to post-industrial societies where we begin to learn newer, cleaner technologies in order to replace those polluting industrial ones. That's not just a political achievement, that's an economic inevitability, according to the scientific modelling underpinning much contemporary sustainability. Which is very comforting, and it's one of the reasons that green growth has a continued hold on the way in which we pursue sustainability, this inevitability of the transition to a low carbon future. But of course, the problem is that this kind of model doesn't say anything about situations like this, where we have huge areas of waste dedicated not to the industrializing societies of the global south, but purely to serve the needs of the supposedly post-industrial societies like us here in the UK, in the US, and indeed the EU. All of this waste is not for Cambodian people where this landfill is sited. That's all created in the service of goods bought in leading global economies. And it's not just waste. We can also see innumerable other examples, such as this here. This again is an export factory for garments exclusively used in countries far away from Cambodia, again, where this is, predominantly in the EU and the UK. And all of this wood you can see is illegally deforested. All of it is used to be burned in boilers, which is used to iron the clothes, which look so nice on the clothes of our, on the racks of our high street shops. There's nothing in that modelling about this ability to displace environmental impacts away from the source of where those goods are used. Because fundamentally, there's a contradiction in the way that we pursue sustainability policy in the world today, which doesn't account for anything like a necessary extent for the huge economic transitions that have happened in our world over the last 50 years. Whereas in the 1970s, countries like us here in the UK produced the majority of the goods that we use within our borders. In the last 50 years, that has completely changed. Now we import the majority of what we use. And the impact of that is twofold. First, it means that the emissions associated with those imports have moved outside of our borders as well, outside of our regulation. And equally importantly, it means that we've lost the ability to oversee those production processes and to actually have visibility over the impacts of our global economy. Now it's moved beyond the regulations of our borders. So all of this takes us back to that headline figure then, this 43%, which is beginning to look a little bit tenuous in light of all that. And in fact, we can put a figure on how tenuous. In reality, the 43%, once we account for our global economy, looks more like 15%, if that. That's the reduction, the net reduction in our carbon emissions as an economy, as a global economy. And there's a word for all of this, moving that 70% of our carbon emissions outside of our borders. This is called carbon outsourcing. It's a huge issue. Essentially, it means getting carbon emissions off the books of the economies that they're used for and moving them to global southern economies which tend to have a little bit more leeway in their environmental regulations. It's also been called carbon colonialism, which is, of course, the key thrust of this book, but the way in which it essentially utilizes lands and places which don't benefit directly from the goods being produced, but rather have to shoulder the environmental burden of their production. And this is not the only way in which this term has been used. There's a lot of discussion now around carbon credits, which is also frequently called carbon colonialism. Carbon credits are when a heavy carbon-intensive industry purchases large tracts of land, predominantly in the global south, in order to plant trees, for example, in order to essentially create a carbon negative area to counteract their carbon intensive industry. This is called carbon colonialism for the way in which it essentially co-opts large areas of productive land in the global south in order to essentially pay the sins, the carbon sins rather, of the industries in the global north. Also the idea of carbon capture, that's sucking carbon out of the air using large machines such as this. It's a largely theoretical technology, but the idea itself has been called carbon colonialism for the way in which it legitimates a system of continued resource extraction in the pursuit of economic growth. And these are just three ways amongst a great many in which carbon colonialism has been used. So one of the things that this book attempts to do is to ask the question, are these actually separate processes? Are these separate dimensions and trends that we're beginning to see within our global economy? Or in fact, does this point to something deeper about the way in which environment and economy interact? And as I argue, in fact, of course it does. We're living now in an era of unprecedented interconnection, mutual economic dependency, the like of which we've never seen. Advances in logistics and telephony have created an economy which is interdependent in a way that couldn't have been imagined even 20 or 30 years ago. But the roots of that economy, which have seen our factory and production processes move from the places in which they're used to countries like Cambodia, like India, like China, on a vast scale in the last 30 or 40 years. The roots of that economic process have their histories far longer than this recent technological transition. And a good way to demonstrate this is to stick with the example that is quite central to the book, the example of the garment industry. Now, of course, one of the things that's created the environmentally destructive nature of the garment industry today is the fast fashion nature of it, the need to get the latest trend. But in reality, at the beginning of this global industry, when we first began the globalization of the garment industry back in the late 18th century, people still had their pursuit of fashion. It was just that it wasn't the latest floral print from Boohoo, it was the latest material. Everybody needs cotton. The UK, Britain, England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, they were going mad for cotton. Everybody wanted it, but the problem is we couldn't make it. We only had old, unfashionable, scratchy wool. So in order to get this cotton, we had to import it from India, from China, who had a complete dominance of the global cotton trade. They were incredibly good at making it, made it very efficiently, and made it to incredibly high quality. But because everybody was going so crazy for this material, then the amount of money flowing out of the British Isles to South Asia was seen by the planners at the time as a major problem. So they set upon the idea of remodeling the global economy of cotton to put Britain at its centre. The problem was that Britain wasn't very good at making cotton. It didn't have the climate, it didn't have the space, and it didn't have the people to do it. So what the planners at the time set upon doing was essentially the usage of lands controlled by political domination in order to recreate the global economy of cotton with Britain at its centre. We didn't have the labour, so Britain took the labour from sub-Saharan Africa. We didn't have the land, so they made use of the British Dominion of North America and used the climatically perfect areas of southern North America, Mississippi, Louisiana, in order to move that labour to produce that cotton. And the capital remained at the centre in the UK with these new machines, the spinning jenny, Arkwright's water frame. This was the beginning of the global economy as we know it today, the separation of land, labour and capital between different countries. And if we look at the way that the global garment industry still functions today, that's pretty much the same story. We still own the machines which are used to produce these goods. Often they're foreign owned by British companies or by other leading economies such as Korea, which own the machines in low-cost labour countries like Cambodia. That's just the labour. And the materials, the cotton, that still comes from other places, from Brazil, from Ivory Coast, from India, Uzbekistan. This global separation of land, labor, and capital in order to produce garments continues to be a reflection and intensification of that hundreds of years old system of economic production of garments. And it's by no means, although the garment industry is a particularly good example of it, it's by no means limited to the garment industry. We look at the humble brick, for example. We're surrounded by bricks. One of the things you always assume about it is that this is about as domestic a project as you can imagine. It's literally made of earth, the earth that surrounds us. So you may be surprised to learn that, in fact, here in the UK, we're the #1 importer of bricks. 16% of all the bricks that we use are imported from beyond our borders. And a rapidly growing proportion of them are from very, very far away, not from factories like this in the UK, which use relatively little labour, but from factories like this in Pakistan and India, where we import about 40 million bricks every year. Now, even setting aside the environmental impacts and the human impacts of what is renowned as a brutal industry, just the basic carbon cost of moving millions upon millions of low-cost, high-weight bricks, 18,000 kilometres from South Asia to the British Isles, is staggering. The weight of carbon associated with one shipping container, just one shipping container of bricks on that 18,000 kilometre journey, is the same as not one, not two, not three, four, but 5 blue whales of carbon emissions. That's just 1,000 of carbon of shipping containers coming all that way. It's quite simply a trade that would never be allowed to happen domestically. The only way in which this industry is allowed to persist is because it's outside of that jurisdiction. It's outside of the national accounting systems on which our global sustainability commitments are made. And fundamentally, what this speaks to is the persistence of the global system of economic production, which persistently moves value to the centre of the global economy, the countries like the UK, whilst leaving waste, emissions, and what is not wanted in that global system of resource extraction at the periphery of the global economy. It's the same system essentially which was put in place in order to fuel the garment industry, in order to fuel Britain's love of cotton back in the 1700s, and it continues to be the same today. Leaving waste in the periphery of the global economy is essentially the basis, it's the underwiring of the economic system we depend on. And our entire legislation, the entire way we measure the environmental impacts of our economy continues to downplay anything that happens outside of our central economies, such as in the UK. And although I've talked about the UK a lot today, it's not only a UK problem. We know that that 43% is dubious. We know that looks more like a 15% reduction in practice. If we think about the EU, which posts a headline figure of 27% carbon emissions reductions since 1990, in fact, that looks more like 11%, but not even down, 11% up. The EU has increased by 11% its total net carbon emissions if you include its international economy, which of course you should, otherwise it makes no sense. And it's unfortunately not only carbon. I've talked a lot about carbon today, but of course waste and something like the trade in plastic exports has skyrocketed in recent years. We've seen plastic exports from a very, very low base in the year 2000 increase exponentially in the coming years. And that's something that we can see now reaching a 600% increase since 2000 in the UK and a 200% increase in the EU. All of which seems rather gloomy, which is why I'm beginning to, well, at this point, we begin to bring in a little of the better news. Because the law in recent years, the rather unfashionable, forgotten tool of the law, has begun to have an impact on some of those environmental bans that we've seen. In 2017, China passed a landmark piece of legislation banning the importation of plastic. Up to that point, plastic exports from wealthy areas like the UK and the EU have been skyrocketing for many, many years. That ban changed the game. It was followed by an EU ban in 2021, and this year, a ban in the UK on single-use plastics. How effective that will be remains to be seen. But we can see this just looking at the numbers involved. Here are the bans as they take place internationally. Look what happens to that UK trade in plastics. From a straight up massive increase in plastic exports, that Chinese ban finally bends down the curve. We should see that accelerate downwards following the UK ban. But actually, the UK has been a relative laggard in its reduction of plastic use. Look at what happened with the EU. As soon as China bans exports of plastic, the EU has massively decreased its international plastic exports. And worldwide, the story is the same. International legislation works, which begs the question when it comes to the headline issue that we're all thinking about, the carbon emissions that continue to warm our atmosphere. Why can't we say the same? This is the curve of global carbon emissions from 1940 to 2023. You can see there's no such heartening downwards curve there, despite the fact that we've seen any number of environmental frameworks attached to attempt to address this problem. In the first World Climate Conference in 1978, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, Kyoto 1997, Copenhagen 2009, Paris 2016, and of course COP26 just a couple of years ago in Glasgow. None of them have had anything like the effect that a simple plastic ban has done. Now, what is the reason for this? Why have we found it so difficult to legislate against carbon? As I argue in this book, the underlying problem is that we continue to see this problem, the issue of carbon, on a domestic level. We continually rely on a nationalist mindset of carbon regulation, which is completely unsuited to the reality, the global reality of environmental degradation around the world. In reality, what we're doing is regulating one tiny corner of a global spiderweb of economy, which doesn't make any sense. If our environmental regulation is to mean anything, it has to recognize that our economy is no longer contained within our borders, but is a reflection of the supply chains on which we depend for everything in our lives. Any kind of carbon or environmental degradation regulation that doesn't take account of those supply chains is essentially meaningless. It creates a huge incentive to outsource the impact of our production beyond our borders. Now, for a long time, it was argued that we couldn't regulate our international economy, that how can we have jurisdiction over other countries? But for the first time in recent years, this has begun last change. In 2017, the first major supply chain law worldwide came in France, followed by 2021, a very weak but nonetheless present UK Environment Act. And finally, this year, the first real tangible supply chain act was the German supply chain law. Now, that law gives anybody affected by environmental abuses in a supply chain of any company trading in Germany the right to challenge that company in a German court. When it comes to international supply chain regulation, this is a game changer. For the first time, it's giving voice to people like Sophia, the capacity, at least the possibility, of hitting back against the invisibility of people like her in global supply chains. These are the greenest of green shoots. It's an incredibly low base at the moment. But to give you an idea of where we're moving, in 2020, there were only 22 cases brought against companies for environmental abuses in their supply chains worldwide. In 2021, that was 178. The trajectory is moving in the right direction. It's the first time that people like Sophia, people like us, have said that this is enough, that we can take control of our environment, our politics, and our climate. Let's just begin. Thank you.
Sure I don't get your foot with me. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's so much in this book, and I was like, how is this going to be condensed in 15 minutes? But that was pretty amazing. I'm going to ask a few questions to just get us started, and then I will open up to the rest of you. I'm sure that you have loads of questions to ask about all of this. And I wanted to kind of zoom out to start with. You know, in many ways, this book is kind of against simplification, like I said at the beginning, and being particular about things, and being concrete about things, and fighting abstraction, I suppose, because so much of the way that the climate problem is talked about in terms of legislation is very abstract, and that allows all sorts of things to happen. And one of the things that I found that I've come across is quite difficult is how do you talk about responsibility and vulnerability without simplification, right? So I remember being in a conversation a while ago where there was a discussion about the term the global south, basically, in which quite a few people were saying that, yeah, like as a person from the geographical global south, I don't really identify with that term. And this sort of made me think, how do we talk about global climate injustice while still keeping all of the intersecting vulnerabilities in mind, of gender, of race, or of class, all of these things. Yeah, what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a very difficult balance to strike. I'm aware of these, the pushback against the simplification of the term the global south. The reason I use it in this book, I think, because from a production point of view, it makes sense to kind of recognize that there are certain winners in this global system of production, and that is not everybody. And if we can separate the real winners from everybody else, then that helps us to see quite how unjust this system is and help to get an overall picture on it. I think the balance to strike really is not to see something like a term like the global south as being a definitive container of any kind, but rather as a call to recognize diversity and complexity, and to recognize essentially that the ways in which we see the world are so dominated by such a small corner of it that we need to really recognize the power and diversity and importance of the other and everything else outside of that. So I think rather than focusing on the global south aspect, it's more the north bit that's important. It's recognizing that there is a small kind of capital intensive area of our global economy, which is by far the greatest winner.
It's also a question of sort of staying flexible, because then there are moments in the book where you sort of question your own kind of terminology and try to find new terminology. And yeah, is it also about that, about trying to constantly be like flexible with what is it exactly that I mean?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the big problems that I try to identify in this book is that the ways in which we understand the global economy and our global environment are extremely abstract because we've lost the ability to see them directly. Our global economy now exists like in diagrams, it exists in the abstract, it exists in logistical charts. So just the fact of actually going up and being face to face with any of it instantly sort of begins to trouble those interpretations. And none of the production processes that we see in practice look anything like they're presented. They're full of holes, there's all kinds of issues. And there's nothing like this kind of clean line of responsibility and mutual production the way it's presented. I mean, in reality, something like the global garment industry is a kind of complex and contested chain of different actors working against each other. Even factories are not necessarily the bad guys in all of this. The factories are presented with relatively small margins. Like the global brands are giving them nothing to work with. Obviously, some of them are abusive, some of them deserve to be sanctioned. But it's the system which is the issue, and the complexities within that system really, when confronted, really do challenge the simple and decarbonising narratives that we have about our global system.
We'll go back to that system in a bit, but you mentioned, seeing what it looks like in real life and coming up face to face with it. This is obviously a work that you've been doing for 15 years. How I was really curious to hear about how you kind of negotiated your role as researcher and as author whilst constantly trying to focus on the stories of people whose voices should be heard um, in this conversation.
Yeah, well, so the issue of positionality is something that I think, I do discuss in the book. There's a chapter which is devoted to that. And I think it's something that brought home to me quite a lot because I've been there for a while, since I was in my early 20s. It's my first project. I was there for 2.5 years working on a project on natural resource management and migration. And then having been out there and knowing people for all that time, you become very aware of privilege, not in the abstract, but in a kind of real, tangible form. One of the key ways that brings it home to me in particular is I've been working with the same guy since I was 23. And now we're in our mid-late 30s, and he's in a very different position to me. I've had so many opportunities that he hasn't had. And we're kind of still in this relationship. So that's it brings it home to me, the fact that we are the same age, the same kind of level of skill, and yet this difference in privilege is so huge in terms of whose voice is projected. Ultimately, it's my voice. I get to speak. He doesn't get to speak. I try to bring it out as much as possible, but this is the key issue that we all face. I mean, one of the things I discuss in the book is the luxury of low-paid work, the way in which to have a voice in global society and in this kind of global conversation. You have to essentially allow yourself, if not a period of kind of unpaid work, but low paid, it takes 10 years to get a PhD, for example, if you want to go into academia. And the number of internships you need to do to get to be a journalist, to be an environmental journalist, to have a voice in this conversation is a huge privilege. It depends on huge privileges. It's extremely unequal. It's accessible only to a small number of people. So I guess the way I try to resolve that is just to try to, above all, foreground the stories of the people I work with, to make it less about what I'm saying and more about trying to bring out what other people are trying to say to me. Because these are conversations that are done in a very earnest, meaningful way. People genuinely want to communicate to the outside world what's going on. We talk to factory workers and they say, it's so hot, I can't bear it, but please do something about this. So that's a responsibility that I have to love to be able to bring out. And I see that, I guess, as the key thing, rather than putting forward my own narrative, helping to communicate that.
Yeah, I really, really love the way that you wrote about that. Something else that you write about from a kind of, I guess, personal experience is telling different audiences about your projects and the kind of questions that come up afterwards. I'm laughing because it's really funny how sometimes people will be like, what can I do? And you're like, nothing. And I sort of wonder, well, there's a couple of things that I wonder around that. One is, I definitely think that most of the time when people ask, what can I do? What can I buy? Or what kind of a consumer can I be? Not what kind of person can I be, which is so much more than that. So I wonder what your take is on that. Is that what people mean most of the time? And also, has that changed at all over the years that you've been doing these like presentations and talking about this? Like, are there more people in certain settings that are politically active, and that where that question has a different connotation, the what can I do question?
Yeah, so this refers to a particular, so when we launched a project called Blood Bricks, which is about the Cambodian brick industry, is an industry of indentured labor, bonded labor, hugely rife with child labor. It's a really brutal kind of industry. And the problem is this is like, it's not even hidden in plain sight, it's just an industry. And everybody knows it's there. You can walk up into these kilns and it's all just kind of completely open. And so we presented this in London and it was horrifying. What we do about this? But not a lot. This was 5 years ago. And I've got to say, I do think the global conversation has changed quite a lot. It was in 2018 that XR was formed. And then those first kind of conversations about activism and using power as citizenship, the power of citizenship rather than the power of consumption, that narrative began to change. And that's something that I'm really big on. What can an individual do is a very difficult question. So yeah, I mean, I'm probably a little bit harsher on sustainable consumption than everybody is comfortable with, because my personal take, and again, there's different views on this. My personal take is that public will and public concern is like a pressure cooker, and to some extent, sustainable consumption is like a safety valve on that, releases a degree of it. People are really concerned about these issues. They have a genuine desire to do something. People have a strong desire for social justice. So I do think a lot of our lack of progress in recent years has been through kind of clever channeling away of some of that public impetus down blind alleys and red herrings. So although I obviously see the value of sustainable consumption in many ways, I've tried to move away from it because I'm so much more interested in sustainable citizenship and using the legal frameworks that we have in order to make real tangible change. And in particular, one of the things that I talk about advocating for is being involved in local government. We have again this huge privilege in the rich world, in countries like here in Scotland, in England, in Europe, even in the US. You have a local government you have access to. We don't tend to use it, but we can make tangible impacts on that local governance just through attending, through pushing for environmental regulations. And we can be part of that change, and that can be a real grassroots movement. And that, above all, is I think what I advocate for in terms of making a difference, making a change.
You mentioned legal framework, and I was just going to briefly mentioning this before the event to you. I'm really interested in hearing some of your thoughts on how it might be possible to use the legal system, not just in terms of the supply chain, but just in terms of climate justice at large. Because there's all these lawsuits, for example, now around the world. There's the whole talk about loss and damage, for example, that came out of COP, and some examples of people who have actually brought governments to account for things that have happened, halfway across the world, that kind of thing. Yeah. What kind of possibilities are there, do you think? And yeah, what is your thinking around working within the system as it is, and challenging the system?
Yeah, it's easy to be despondent about these things because, yeah, there have been a lot of cases and they don't seem to make that much of a dent. But what I would say is that you can't use the law effectively until the law is there. So in recent years, environmental justice advocates and people who have attempted to use the law for really productive environmental purposes have had the massive roadblock of the fact that so much of what happens in our global economy is, in this kind of black hole of the environment, beyond jurisdiction. And that's been a massive issue. And I think with that recent slew of laws, it's really just beginning to give people tools to really push back against these kinds of things I'm talking about. Once that framework is there, then we can use it. And there's more than enough will, more than enough knowledge and skill to use it. It will be used once the German supply chain law comes in, and hopefully that will be replicated in other countries. It will make a change because there's so many people who would use it. And that's why I do end on some optimism this year that we can use these kind of legal frameworks and push for more. That's really, really important.
Where are we in the UK? How close could we be to something like that German supply chain?
Well, so we have the British. So the British unfortunately went down the French route, putting something with kind of no teeth. It has no provisions as to what happens. It's more like similar to the Modern Slavery Act, which actually just asks companies to have a statement, and it doesn't actually have any provision for what happens if their statement is wrong or like they're breaching any of their own terms. So it's a toothless law. Some people think it's better than nothing. I mean, but the point is, once there's a model in place in a leading economy, then there is every reason to think that can and will be replicated elsewhere. In the UK, supply chain legislation, what we do in the environments around the world is a complete, it's a disaster. And we have quite strong environmental regulation. I realize it seems like that, sewage all over our beaches. But with some exceptions, we have a fairly robust legal framework for what happens in this country. As soon as it goes out of the borders, it's like it doesn't exist. The problem is the incentive that creates is that you can get this cheap, environmentally destructive production overseas, and then we can use it, completely cost-free, like consequence-free in this country. There is so much desire, honestly, to put an end to that. Most people can see that that's completely wrong. So I do have some hope that it will change, but at the moment, there's very little to work with.
But you're right in that if people know that this thing exists, then that is something that we as organizers and as activists and as citizens can actually push for. And say, well, there it is. You know, that's the starting point. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience now. So if you've been sitting with something, now is the time to make it into a question. I have more, but I think it's time to share a little bit. So do you raise your hand if you've got a question?
And then will you repeat it back?
Yes,
Or
okay.
if you want to give a brief version for anyone else.
So rather than passing the mic, we'll do that.
Yes, because I don't know how long they're going to be.
Oh,
And I'll check web questions.
okay. There you go.
Thanks. And I really enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you. And I had two related questions to pose with that. And my first one is kind of admiring the discussion on the book side and how you kind of talk about that also tested and legal framework, right? See also that if we're relying upon existing legal frameworks, and of course many existing legal frameworks have kind of legal colonial legacies, these kind of things. I'll be interested to know, if, in your opinion, what is the kind of interface between civil society and legal frameworks and that are often relying upon like legal colonial legacies that might enable other forms of protections that might intersect with environmental protections as well, like public rights, where civil protection, etc. And I feel like, yeah, so I've learned kind of between Cambodia, so another example where like more civil society organized struggles are kind of pushing back the game for before reforms to the legal framework and it might gender changes. And related to that, you see much hope in essentially we have kind of like reopen the power to kind of play with, you know, like beyond national determined contributions. You see much hope, you see much campaign for that, and or we kind of stuck with national determined contribution, and now the task is what we're doing in the making of it. But I was a couple of questions more.
Okay, so civil society and legal frameworks in the global south. To what extent is that happening? I mean, it depends. So if we take global south as this huge blanket that includes everything that is like a very rich as well, then I mean, there's one of the things. There's good examples and bad examples. So like in places like in South America, for example, in Ecuador, and Bolivia, we're actually developing really very strong environmental frameworks, even to the extent of giving nature a personhood, which gives kind of nature sort of some of the rights of a person to kind of self-replication and self-flourishing. Which obviously this is kind of a game changer in terms of the way that we see our relationship with nature, and it comes from theory around the way in which some of those things that you're mentioning there, like the colonial relationship between humans and nature, which inherently puts humans above nature. And according to some legal scholars, as soon as you do that in any kind of framework, then destruction of the lower one is almost inevitable once you create that framework. So in places like in South America in particular, there are some hopeful green shoots there. In Cambodia, there's the situation is rather different. There's actually a flourishing civil society and a huge environmental movement, but the problem is it's been a really quite substantial authoritarian turn in Cambodia in the last 5 years. There was a sort of pseudo-democracy from 1993 until 2018, but with the main opposition party having been banned in 2018, and then now the sort of much reduced zombie opposition party having been banned again this year, the next election, then the capacity for civil society to have a direct political influence on legislation is quite limited. Nonetheless, you do what you can. And there's a way to influence government. So it's not a deadlock, but it's a difficult environment. And in terms of the moving away from nationally determined contributions, the second question, this is a difficult one because so many people benefit, or so many powerful voices benefit from the nationally determined contributions. This is a system that places like the UK really do very well out of. So you're not going to get the UK speaking up against this. and again, the US similarly. So that's an issue. I would say there's no hope in at the next cycle, but having seen there was at least some sort of surface level progress on loss and damage that you mentioned earlier, actually, at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh. So loss and damage is, of course, almost not quite reparations, but essentially providing adaptation funds as a condition of being involved in these climate frameworks to the most affected countries. That was a sort of radical fringe agenda at COP26, and it somehow got to the centre at COP27. So these things can move with enough pressure into the mainstream of climate negotiations. But what I would warn there is that the way in which loss and damage was co-opted in COP26 actually has rendered it again pretty toothless. So that's the danger. We might well see moving away from national determined contributions, but whether it actually happens in a way that has a meaningful impact, you have to be radical cynics is the term that I use in the book.
I really like that. Let's do the one online.
Okay. So, Sean, are there any laws or initiatives that people of the global south want to see the North implementing or are trying to push to feed back up distribution chains?
Yes, definitely. I think that, speaking to people in these global production chains, what they want is for people in the factories that make our clothes or our goods or our food to have similar protections that we have and that workers in our country have. This is what directly people say. A key example is heat, right? In places like Cambodia, but also equally, even more so in Bangladesh, you see right now, have a huge heat wave conditions. And many of the factories in these countries, especially in Cambodia, are not built for purpose in the way that they would be necessarily here. A lot of them are converted warehouses. They're not really suitable for thousands of people to work in, especially not under these new kind of heat wave conditions. So as a result of that, heat stress or even heat stroke is really quite common, and workers complain about it all the time. It's just stifling to work there. And people say, I just want the kind of CEO of the brand to have some oversight here to see what's going on. But instead, they stay there and we stay here and the reports go back and everything looks fine. So yeah, just having more of a sense of the workers in our supply chains as being our workers and part of our society, and having a legal framework to support that. Absolutely what these workers want. It's just the basis of having a fairer and healthier global supply chain and some justice in the goods that we produce.
Any other questions from people present? Quite a few.
I think thinking about the German supply chain, do the workers along the supply chain have to pay for inflation support, or is it free?
Yeah, so is there any legal support for people bringing cases against companies abusing the supply chains? Yeah, good question. No, there isn't, which is of course a massive problem. And again, equally, there's not any financial support, there's not any kind of legal support to help people deal with the language and the processes involved. So yeah, there's all kinds of intersecting inequalities and unequal privileges that completely reduce the capacity of anyone to express their voice and pursue their interests within this global system. But the legal framework, if you have that, then you have a chance. And environmental advocacy groups, legal advocacy groups, can step in some of the cases. It's not necessarily for every person who suffers from abuse in the supply chain to be able to make that case. All you really need is for enough landmark cases to take place that companies recognize that if they step that far out of line, then that someone's going to take them on. So I think that's the way we have to see it, as a kind of step in the right direction, and something that there's a massive role for environmental civil society to use and move forward with. Well, it could be useful, but it's like it could be useful as a technological tool. As a solution in itself, I'm not sure. But the problem is, as soon as people have a choice whether they're going to use something, um, then I mean, the people who are doing something that's environmentally fine are going to use it, and the people who are going to do something they don't want to be seen are not going to use it. So you have to have a kind of a framework that enforces the use of a technology or a particular code to ensure that everybody does it. Otherwise, problems just move.
Any other questions? I have another question. And that's, we were talking about them briefly as well before, and which is kind of related to the "what can I do" question. Another one that I think anyone talking about climate justice gets is what gives you hope. So I'm not going to ask that, but I am going to ask you, what do you hope for at the moment?
Well, I mean, in a very tangible sense, I think you won't be surprised to say I hope for a really rigorous supply chain act so that we regulate what happens in our global economy. That's the first thing. But to get from here to there, what I hope is that people will start to exercise their kind of radical environmental citizenship, get involved in grassroots politics. It's really something that any of us can do, get involved in a local council, for example, and push for there's something like a ban on imported bricks. It's something that we've already done on the basis of the work. You can do this in councils and just lobby your council and say that we want this to happen. We don't want these imported goods, unregulated goods to be used in this ward. It can happen. You know, you have that direct contact with the political authority. So moving away from environmental consumption to sustainable citizenship, I think will be absolutely key, and that's the change I'd like to see.
It also just made me wonder about, and we've not touched on it before, what does it mean that so many of us see our power as ending with consumption? And is there a change that needs to happen in terms of self-image, of like, what is an activist, and can we all be activists, and are there certain kind of stereotypes about activists that we sort of break through? And I mean, you said like sustainable citizenship. Yeah, a little bit more about that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing I think is there's more than one tool that's necessary in this armory. So I mean, I do have a lot of admiration for the kind of radical activism that we've seen in recent years from groups like XR and Just Stop Oil. It created a conversation that isn't otherwise possible. We only saw, I mean, for example, the most recent example is around the snooker event, for example, the destruction of the snooker. That created a huge conversation that lasted weeks, as did the Van Gogh suit action. So these things, they get coverage and they start conversations. I mean, there's positives and negatives, but otherwise, if you don't do this, I mean, otherwise you get nothing. So keeping this issue in the public mind, I think, is a really important issue. And actually, I think it's particularly important because people are so concerned about climate at the moment. This is a high point in the UK, in this country. This is a high point for kind of public involvement and engagement on the issue of climate change. People have never been so concerned. But we have to not be complacent about that, because actually we've been close to here before. Back in 2008, 2010, that was the last high point, and that was the point at which you had Sienna Miller and Leonardo DiCaprio saying, "I'll never fly a private jet again." And it was like cool and super cool to be green. And again, at that point, it felt like the world was on the verge of a real change. But on the back of various combined things, such as ClimateGate, which is where a bunch of emails from the University of East Anglia got leaked, which kind of fueled a few climate conspiracy theories, and a few cold summers in a row. There was a massive dip for a decade in public concern over this. So keeping public concern high, keeping people recognizing the need to do something about that, that's one job. And being involved in the nuts and bolts of grassroots pushing for stronger legislation, that's another job. Being involved in environmental advocacy groups, that's a further one. Even being involved, in writing and pushing for new ways of understanding, helping people communicate their views in the global south. That's another one. So, yeah, I mean, that's, I think there's a phrase in Nepal like we're all flowers in one garland. So that's the way I think to think of a progressive environmental movement.
Yeah, and in terms of reframing as well, which is one of the things that your book does, that I was thinking when you were saying that there was this high point in 2010, and then I guess to some extent 2019 was a high point as well in terms of activism in this part of the world for tackling the climate crisis. But a lot of the time it is still seen or talked about as a future issue. And what your book does is it tells the story of climate injustice, the history of climate injustice, and what is happening now and has been happening for 500 years. So yeah, it's about reframing it as well, for sure. I think I'm getting sort of eyes from Mayuri that we're close on time. Do we have any last questions?
That's the last one.
I think you're good to go. Yeah.
It's kind of on that theme. And so I was really interested in in Cambodia again as an example. Do you see any practices whereby folk might not necessarily self-identify as activists, or maybe there's a bunch of people who shouldn't identify as activists that might be doesn't have down legally or whatever, but who nonetheless maybe enacted, organised in ways that configure or anticipate less impactful, more sustainable, more just ways of organising workplaces or organising material exchange or public exchange, all these kind of things. Are there any kind of practice there that's kind of going on? Like, I'm not an activist as such, I'm not a consumer, but these kinds of processes bring people together and anticipate better futures, more just futures.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, if you want hope, I mean, just have a look at the environmental movement in Cambodia against all the odds. Literally lethal odds. I mean, Chok Bati was a very famous environmental activist in Cambodia, shot dead in 2010. So since then, it's been a very dangerous game. He's not the only one. I met a couple of filmmakers, very young filmmakers at COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago. And that was their route to avoid the kind of lethality of being directly involved in environmental regulation, was to communicate through film, kind of get an international audience. I was just very impressed. They didn't speak a word of English, and it was freezing in Glasgow. And of course, it was like the middle of COVID and everything, so it was all outdoor tent. So these two brave, young filmmaking activists who come all this way, completely isolated, but just out of sheer commitment to do this. So that gives me a lot of hope. On something I think we can all do though is, in Cambodia as here, unions are important. It's a little bit more of a complex interrelationship in the UK. Unions have tended historically to have a bit of an ambiguous relationship to green issues, but I think the beginnings of a red-green synthesis potentially there. And in places like Cambodia, it's really important. Union movements, although they're prevented from having the same political power that they previously did,